There we go. Somebody had put the mute switch on me. I'll find out who you are. Okay, Mark chapter 8, beginning at verse 27. As we begin looking at this section, we mentioned last week's chapter 8, verse 27. It's going to go through chapter 10, about verse 52. This is the time when Jesus, this is kind of midway point in this book of Mark too, but it's the time when Jesus has steadfastly set his face toward Jerusalem. What's the purpose of that? What's so important about steadfastly setting his face toward Jerusalem? What's that? No, he's determined to go to Jerusalem. Why? What's going to happen in Jerusalem? He's going to die there. He's going to be put to death. He's going to be crucified. And yet, in spite of that, he has steadfastly set his face toward that. I mean, he's determined that he's going to accomplish the will that God's given him to do. Now, it's going to be interesting because some of the things we're going to see in this section, before we get to that, there's some other things that happen that make it more difficult for Jesus in that regard. So as we begin looking at this, really, this next section is going to contain a number of things. It's going to be about Jesus and his disciples. They're in Galilee, but instead of going straight on toward Jerusalem, he's first of all going to go north up to Caesarea Philippi. And there's some reasons for that. We'll talk about this as we go along. But it's while he's there also that Peter is going to make that confession that Jesus Christ is the Son of the living God. And so that's going to be established here. And it's interesting because of the way in which it's established in this place. So as we begin looking at these first few verses here, and these coming from the New King James Version, excuse me. Now Jesus and his disciples went out to the towns of Caesarea Philippi, and on the road he asked his disciples, saying to them, "Who do men say that I am?" So they answered, "John the Baptist, but some say Elijah, and others one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered and said to him, "You are the Christ." Then he strictly warned them that they should tell no one about him. And so here we began looking at this. He's going up now to this area with his disciples, to this area of Caesarea Philippi. Some important things about this place. Caesarea Philippi is an ancient city. It's something that was established by Philip, one of the sons of Herod. He established it to honor Caesar. But there's already a town by the name of Caesarea that's over on the coast of the Mediterranean coast. And so this one is called Caesarea Philippi. Now, I'm not sure how well you'll be able to see that, but as you look at it, here is Caesarea over on the coast, and here's Caesarea Philippi up here. And so it's named to honor Caesar, but to distinguish it from the other Caesarea, it's called Caesarea Philippi, and that's after Philip. So he's managed to get his own self recognized in this too, but this is a grand city here, but it's important for a number of reasons to a number of different religious groups, because this place here was filled with all kinds of temples to different gods that were worshipped there. One of those, most prominent, was Baal. And this was a primary god of the Assyrian nation. But so many of the nations in this land, when Israel came in, had to drive all these nations out, so many of those nations worshipped Baal. And it even came in time to affect Israel, that some of them began to worship Baal. But there are a number of temples to Baal located in this place. And so it's very important. It was an important place to the Assyrian nation, because this is where they believed that Baal was honored most, like it was all the temples they had to him. But it was also a place here where, according to William Barclay, and this is that's established, that there was a beautiful white marble temple made to honor Caesar. And so a lot of people would come to this place to make sacrifices to Caesar. And so it was an important place into the Roman nation. And then there was also in this place a cave where many believed and taught that the god Pan was born. P-A-N. This was a Greek god. Pan was a god that supposedly was half man and half goat. And he was a god that terrified a lot of people. He had that ability, it said, that he could terrify animals and man too. And because of that, we get a word in our English language from Pan. Panic. It comes from that. And the city, before being established here for Caesar and being honored there and having these temples built to him there, it was a town called Banias, which was another way of saying Panias, P-A-N-I-A-S, which was given because they believed that this was where Pan was born. There was a cave there that they believed Pan had been born there. And so it's a place now that's, to the Assyrian people, it's important religiously because that's where they have all these temples to Baal. It's important to the Romans because that's where they have that great marble temple to Caesar. And it was an important religious place for the Greeks because this is where they believed Pan was at. And so they would gather there to worship and serve them. So many of the ancients would gather in this place to worship the various gods that they have. And so I think it's kind of unique that it's in this place that Jesus brings his disciples, and while they're there, he raises a question to them, and that is, he wants to know, who do men say that I am? And that was an important question. You know, the people wanted to know this. So that's why they've come here. Who do men say that I am? Well, let's see, we're not wanting to advance. And they're doing something in there. Okay. All right, we'll have to hold up on that then. All right, anyhow, so who do men say that I am? Jesus is asking his disciples that. And there are a variety of answers that they gave. Some were saying that he was John the Baptist risen from the dead. Now, who specifically do you know of that believed that? That believed that Jesus was really John the Baptist risen from the dead? We've already talked about that once before in here. Let me see if I wrote the verse down here for we can just let somebody read that for us. Yeah, turn over to Matthew chapter 14 and verse 2. Matthew 14 and verse 2. Darnell, I'll ask you if you'll read that for us.
And he said to his servants, this is John the Baptist. He has been raised from the dead, that is why these miraculous powers are at work in him.
Okay, that's Herod speaking. Remember now, Herod is the one who had arrested John and put him in prison because John had said it's not right for you to have your brother Philip's wife. And he's married to Philip's former wife, Herodias. And Herodias hates John. She's not satisfied with him just being in prison. So she's worked things out eventually to bring about his death. And it is Herod Antipas who kills John the Baptist. And so now his conscience is bothering him. And he's one of them saying, listen, that this Jesus is really John the Baptist risen from the dead. That's why he's able to do all these miracles and why he's doing all these miracles. Which seems kind of strange because John the Baptist himself did know miracles. But now that Jesus is there doing miracles, at least Herod is convinced that this is John the Baptist. So that's what some of them are saying, that you're John the Baptist risen from the dead. Who else did they say that Jesus might be? Elijah. Now, who's Elijah? He was a prophet of God. To the Jewish mind, they believed that Elijah was probably the greatest of the Old Testament prophets. And Elijah was a great man. He did not write any books or anything like you have from Isaiah and Jeremiah and Daniel and so forth, but he was a very well-known prophet, a very well-respected prophet by the Jews. But in the book of Malachi, there are prophecies made in regard to the coming of the Messiah. For example, in chapter 4 and verse 5, it says, behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And so God has promised before the coming of the Messiah, he's going to send Elijah ahead of him. And the disciples had asked Jesus about that earlier. Why is it, he says, that that Elijah is to come first. And Jesus explains to them, that John the Baptist is really the one he's talking about. He's come in the spirit of Elijah. And so some say he's Jesus, that Jesus is John the Baptist risen from the dead. Some say that it's Elijah that's to come before the Messiah. Mark doesn't say anything more about any of the prophets specifically, but in Matthew's account, there's one other prophet mentioned. Jeremiah. What do you know about Jeremiah? What kind of a prophet was he? The weeping prophet. Why is he the weeping prophet? What's he prophesying about? Yeah, he's prophesying about the destruction of Jerusalem and how that God's people would be carried away into Babylonian captivity, and he weeps over them because of that. He makes the statement in Jeremiah, "Oh, that my head were a fountain of waters, that I might weep day and night for my people." The book of Lamentations is written by Jeremiah. What does Lamentations mean? Lamenting. Again, it's the sorrow being expressed in the weeping. And he's lamenting because he's looking down at the city of Jerusalem after it has been destroyed. And so he's the weeping prophet. But many of the Jews believed, and there were those that taught, that before the Messiah came, that what happened here at this time, before the city of Jerusalem was destroyed by Babylon, that Jeremiah the prophet went in and he took the Ark of the Covenant and also the altar of incense, and he carried it away and he hid it in one of the mountains around Jerusalem. I think some said Mount Nebo. And according to these Jewish people, they believed that before the Messiah came, Jeremiah would come back and he would bring back the Ark of the Covenant and that altar of incense and bring it back, and glory would be restored to Israel again. So they were looking, at least some of them, looking for Jeremiah to come back. Now, there's nothing in the Bible that talks anything about that, mention it, but that may be one of the reasons why some of the people are saying that Jesus is Jeremiah. They're looking for him to bring these things back, these artifacts, and restore glory to Israel before the Messiah comes. So different ideas they have. But all of these that are mentioned, John the Baptist and Elijah and Jeremiah, all of these were prophets of God. And so, in addition to that, Mark and Matthew, after naming some of these individuals by name, they say, are one of the prophets. And so, it doesn't matter who you choose, they all believe, it seems like, that Jesus is one of the prophets that God has sent to deliver his message to the people. Now, when you think about being called a prophet of God, do you look at that as being a compliment or an insult? What's that? A compliment. You know, to be a spokesman of God, someone that he has chosen to deliver his message to the people, a great compliment. But, for one thing, that's all they saw in Jesus. He's a prophet. They didn't understand truly who he really, really was. Probably these people felt like, we're paying a compliment to Jesus. We're recognizing him as being a good person, a real prophet of God. And I think there are people like that today who like to think that they are really complimenting Jesus when they say, he was a good man. And anytime I think about that, I think about Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell was an agnostic. He was a philosopher from England, but he taught, I believe, at New York University for a while. There were those who tried to get him fired because of the fact that he was an agnostic. But he wrote a book entitled Why I'm Not a Christian. And in that book, he tried to point out what he felt like were mistakes in Jesus' life. But he began by saying, he said, I believe Jesus was a good man. And some of the things that he taught, we would do well, he said today, to follow what he said. But he never would go beyond that, a good man. He did go on to say he was a good man, but he wasn't the best man. And he felt like Socrates was a better man than Jesus. But now, some people think, even this man has said that Jesus was a good man. But see, what's wrong with that? There was a failure for them to see beyond that and to understand who Jesus really, really was.
Was actually the Son of God.
Yeah, that's it. He was actually the Son of God. And this is why we get to this when Peter talks about it. Jesus then turns to his disciples. Now, we know what men have said about me, who I am. Now, who do you say that I am? And so, we're still not ready to advance yet. Okay. All right, Peter was the one to answer. What did Peter say? What's that? Thou art Christ. You're the Messiah. Now, that's in Mark's account. You look in Matthew's account, Matthew gives more information as to what Peter said. In Matthew, what did he say? Yeah, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And so, Peter, and probably the other apostles too, recognize something about Jesus. Jesus is more than just a good man. I read a statement one time attributed to Napoleon Bonaparte, of all people, but he listened to some of his men one night discussing about Jesus. And some of them were saying that Jesus was just a man. And Napoleon, accordingly, his statement made to them was, "Gentlemen, I know men, and I tell you, Jesus is more than a man." So he had this concept. Yes, Jesus is a good man, but he's more than that. He's more than a man. And that's exactly what Peter was saying here. He is more than a man. He is the Christ. Now, what does that mean? What's the Hebrew word for that? What's that? Messiah. That's the Hebrew term that was used for them. Christ is the Greek word, Christos, but they both mean the same thing. Do you know what they mean? Anointed one. And so, saying he's the Christ, saying he's the Messiah, saying he's the anointed one. Every king that God chose to rule over Israel was anointed to be king. Anointed usually oil, holy oil poured on them, anointing them, established them to be the king. Well, for Jesus to be the Christ, to be the Messiah, means that he is one who is anointed to be king over God's kingdom. Not just being king over Israel or any other nation or all the nations. He is king over God's kingdom, the church. And God has anointed him for that very purpose. And so, when Peter says, "You are the Christ," we need to understand this is the anointed one of God, the one chosen by God and appointed by God to be the king over his kingdom, which is the church. But in addition to that, Peter also says, "You are the Son of the living God." No. What does that tell you then about Jesus? It's recognizing him as being more than a prophet. He's even more than being the anointed king. He's deity. He is the Son of the living God. His relationship to God, he's the Son of God. And, just to say the Son of God is really not sufficient, because I mentioned Pan a while ago. Pan supposedly was the son of Hermes, who was a higher god. And so he was the Son of God. But Jesus here is the Son of the living God. What's the difference? All of these idols, it's emphasized over and over again that the idols are dead gods. The Bible talks about it, and Jeremiah speaks of it. They cannot do you any good. They cannot do you any harm. So don't be afraid of an idol. An idol cannot move on its own. Somebody got to pick it up and carry it somewhere and set it down. That's an idol. It's a dead God. Jesus is not the son of a dead God. He's the Son of the living God, the only one who is a true God. So Christ himself is God. John begins his gospel in John chapter 1 and verse 1 saying what? In the beginning was what? Was the Word. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. And you look down to verse 14, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld His glory, glory as of the only begotten of the Father. And so Christ, He is God. And so that's what Peter's acknowledging here. You know, it's not just that he is the one who's been anointed to be king over God's kingdom. He is God Himself. He is deity. And so that's important here to understand that. Now, I think that Jesus had some reason for this when He talks about this, you know, that He's brought them up into this area where all these different nations, have temples there to worship different gods that they serve. And it's in that very area that Jesus says, "Who do you say I am?" And Peter confesses He's the Christ, the Son of the living God. So acknowledging that's important. But as soon as Peter said that, Jesus gives this command to them. And His command is, you don't tell anyone about it. Now, why would that be the case? The greatest truth here about Jesus is He's the Son of the living God, and Jesus said, don't tell anybody about it. Why does He not want His disciples doing that? All right, yeah, the Jews are looking for a king. They might be, wanting to, and this happened on occasion, they wanted to take Him and make Him to be king when they didn't really understand about it. And the problem is that even yet the apostles do not fully understand about Jesus and about what it means in being the Messiah and being the Son of the living God. Because Jesus goes on and He talks to them about His death and His coming resurrection. Verses 31 to 33, chapter 8. And He began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He spoke this word openly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when he had turned around and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter, saying, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not mindful of the things of God, but the things of men." The disciples do not yet understand that. Still here in Mark, turn over to chapter, first of all, let's see here at verse. If you look at verse 32 that we just read, where it talks about Jesus spoke openly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Peter didn't yet understand what it meant in being the Messiah. Yeah, the Messiah is the anointed one to be king over God's kingdom, but the Messiah also was to be one who would suffer and He would die and then would be raised again. But they didn't understand that. Now look over to chapter 10. If I can find the right verse here. All right. Let me check, see if I wrote that down. I might not have written it down, and I should have. It's here in Matthew chapter or Mark chapter 10, I believe, where the statement is made. And if you've got your, what's that? Verse 32 also. Yeah, that's where he mentions but there's a statement made when he talked about it that the disciples began talking among themselves, wondering what this meant. In other words, they didn't yet understand about when he keeps talking about dying. They don't understand that. And obviously Peter didn't understand that. Because when Jesus here begins to teach them about that He's going to have to suffer many things at the hands of these scribes and chief priests and elders. That was like it was something new to them that they weren't expecting. And then Jesus clearly makes a statement that he would be killed. Now, Jesus had talked about his sufferings before, and he had talked about his death before. But it seemed like it was always not clear-cut. There were allusions, maybe, that he would make to his suffering and to his death. We've talked about one of these before as we looked at it in the book of Matthew. Jesus made the statement there about that. He said, as long as the friends of the bridegroom, the friends of the bridegroom mourn as long as the bridegroom's with them. They can't do that. They cannot mourn as long as they have the bridegroom with them. But then he says, but the days will come when the bridegroom will be taken away from them, and then they will fast. That's Matthew 9:15. So he's talking about his death. But it's not in clear cut. You know, the bridegroom, as long as the bridegroom's present, they can't mourn. But the time's coming when the bridegroom's be taken away. Well, there were times when the disciples would hear Jesus say something, and, you know, they would just think, well, this is kind of like some of his parables. It's an illusion, and they're not sure what he's talking about. They don't understand it. But now here in Mark, he makes it crystal clear to them about what he's going to suffer at the hands of these elders, scribes, and chief priests, and be killed. But even so, they can't grasp that. And there are things to be said about it. But first of all, before we get, let's look at these people that are going to reject him, the ones who are going to be opposed to him and that. The elders, chief priests, and scribes. Now, the word elders, the word in the Greek is the word presbyteros, but it's used sometimes, and initially it was used to describe what? An older person, an older man. But in times, it came to have more significance as someone who might become the leader of a family or the leader of a tribe. And why? Why having an older man to be the leader? What do you generally associate with an older person? So, wisdom. You know, he's been around longer. He's experienced more than the young ones have. And so, in all likelihood, he's going to have more wisdom. He's going to know more than you do. And so because of that, many times in choosing those to be the leaders, it would be someone who was elder. And so that word elder itself came to be used of those who were leaders among God's people. Now, in this instance, these elders, now that's talking about among the Jews. It's not talking about of the church. But these elders talking about probably were those who are part of the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was kind of the supreme court of the Jewish people. It was consisted of 71 men. And some of those men that are there would be elders, older men, who are deemed wise and able to be on that court. And the same thing would be true of the chief priest. Now, when we talk about the chief priest, it's not talking about the high priest. There's only one high priest, but this is plural, chief priests. And I didn't find a whole lot about it in any of the dictionaries I was looking up, but in the analytical Greek lexicon describing this word that's used there for them, it says, these were the priests belonging to or connected with the high priest or his office. So there were a lot of priests among God's people, of course, but these that are called chief priests are those who are associated with the high priest, with his family or with his court, those who are working with him. And again, these would be the ones who would be a part of the Sanhedrin. And then the third, the scribes. Now, what is a scribe? What's that? People who record things. And so, generally speaking, their humble task that they might be given were things along that line. They may make copies of the Old Testament law and prophets for use in the synagogue. You know, we can go to a store nowadays and buy a Bible and have what we want, but they had to make individual copies, and so the scribes were the ones who would do that. They were the ones who were entrusted to make sure that they copied that word exactly right, because these words are going to be used in the synagogues for teaching the people. And so maybe that would be the humble task they'd have, but there were also other things that they would be doing as a scribe. They might be used as a notary to draw up a paper and seal to show that they can verify this, the signature or whatever, or the legality of the document. They can write out contracts of sale. If you want to sell something, a scribe would be the one to write out that contract for you. They might also make covenants of espousals. And so that would be done. But those were considered the more humble work. But if a scribe really became noted for the work that he's doing, and because he's making copies of the law, many times they became very knowledgeable of what the law said. And so sometimes in the Bible they're called lawyers for that very reason. And so for them, the highest honor they could receive is not in making copies of the Bible, but in appointed to the Sanhedrin. And so you had scribes who were also members of the Sanhedrin. And this is the group that here in Mark, Jesus says, they are going to make judgments upon Jesus as the Christ, and they're going to reject him. Now, again, that word that he uses there was interesting. To reject means literally fail to pass the scrutiny. So the Sanhedrin, and they are the ones that do try Jesus, and what they're going to do is they're going to scrutinize Jesus. They're going to examine what he says about himself and what he said to others and what he's done. And at the end of it all, they're going to reject him. No, you're not the Messiah. You're not the Son of God. You're a blasphemer. You're one deserving of death. They're rejecting him. And that's what's happening. But now, just to tie in with that, how will that apply to us? You know, we need to be careful and realize that in judgment, it's Jesus who's going to be scrutinizing us. And Jesus is going to be the one to determine whether or not we're to be rejected or not. Now these people scrutinize Jesus and reject him. They fail to realize that being who he is, the Son of God, someday they're going to stand before him to be scrutinized by him and be rejected because they've rejected him. And I think the Apostle Paul understood something about this when he wrote 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 27. And Paul said, "But I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I myself should become disqualified." Paul's concerned about that. He knows he'll have to stand before God, and he doesn't want to be rejected by God. Well, that's why Paul says, I buffet my body. I beat my body to bring it into subjection, to do what I know God wants me to do. Because if I don't, he says, I'm afraid that after I've done all this teaching and preaching to other people to how they need to serve God and live faithfully to God, that I myself might become a failure in this, and I might be cast off and be disqualified. So that's going to happen, Jesus said. These men are going to do this to me, and eventually they're going to put him to death. He will be killed. It's not just saying I'm going to die. He's saying I'm going to be murdered. I'm going to be killed by these men. Now again, that was so foreign to so many of the Jewish people. When they thought about the Messiah, what did they think about him? What's the Messiah going to be like? What's he going to do for Israel?
King on the white horse.
Yeah, he's the king on the white horse. He's going to be the one who's going to lead us and going to destroy all of our enemies. He's going to be victorious over all of our enemies and destroy them. And Israel will become the great nation. It'll be God's kingdom that rules over all kingdoms. That's what they're looking for. Now, there are passages, there are so many prophecies given in the Old Testament that the Messiah is going to suffer. And you look at Isaiah 53, but the Jews didn't want to hear that. They wanted to hear about this great Redeemer, this great leader that's going to provide victory for all of us. And he is, but not like they're thinking about. And so because of that, they didn't want to hear about that. And the rabbis, in essence, kind of, gave in to them. I'll preach to you what you want to hear. And so they would preach about the Messiah being this victorious leader for them. And they didn't want to talk about him suffering and about him dying. You know, how can that be? Yes, sir, Merrill?
It's ironic because Revelation talks about Jesus riding on a white horse and the sword in his mouth and the word of God.
Right. And he leads them to victory. But his victory is not a physical warfare because his kingdom is not a physical kingdom. It's spiritual. And he's going to give them the spiritual victory over sin that will allow them to live forever with God. And so that's what he's offering to them. But like I said, they still did not understand it. And that becomes evident here with Peter. When Peter hears that, that Jesus says, I'm going to be afflicted by these people. I'm going to be put to death. And then I'm going to be raised again on the third day. And Peter rebuked Jesus for that. Now, again, this is interesting. When Jesus said all this, when he said that I'm going to be afflicted by these people and I'm going to be put to death, he said that before the multitude. So it's not just his disciples, but all the other people are there to hear him, are hearing the same thing. And Peter doesn't like that. And so Peter led Jesus away from the multitude. Some have suggested it's possible maybe Peter took Jesus by the hand and led him away from the multitude. And when he got him away, then Peter begins to rebuke Jesus for what he has said. And Peter says to him, "Far be it from you, Lord, this shall not happen to you." That's Matthew's account of it, Matthew chapter 16. No, you're not going to die. You're not going to suffer. That's not the way it is. Maybe Peter has that old idea in mind, that the Messiah is going to lead us to victory. Now, if you'd said, hey, these people are going to oppose us, but don't worry, we're going after them and we're going to destroy them. But he doesn't say that. They're going to afflict me and they're going to kill me. And Peter just feels like that can't be. Lord, that's not going to happen to you. And so he just doesn't want to believe it. And so Jesus' response is to rebuke Peter. And I'll tell you something. You look at Matthew 23 and read the rebuke that Jesus gave of those scribes and Pharisees. And over again, woe unto you scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites. The rebuke that he gave of them, I don't think is near as harsh as the rebuke he gave to Peter. On this occasion, what he says to him. He says to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." Now, he's not saying that Peter is Satan. He's not even saying that Peter is satanic in his life. But he just simply said, Peter, you don't understand. You are opposing the very will of God. And that's happened before, and it's going to happen again with Peter. And so Peter, when he says to him, "Get behind me, Satan." And then Jesus lets him know, you're not for the things of God, but for the things of men. And again, in Matthew's account, he adds more to it. He says, "You are an offense to me." Now, what does that mean? Yeah, maybe, but there's something else about that. Anybody have the American Standard Version? Can read Matthew 16:23. 16:23, yes, sir.
But he turned and said unto Peter, "Get thee behind me, Satan. Thou art a stumbling block unto me, for thou mindest not the things of God, but the things of men."
Okay, you're a stumbling block to me. Now, what's a stumbling block? Well, it's something that causes you to stumble. Now, just start and think about this for just a minute. Jesus is headed toward death. He knows that, but he steadfastly set his face to Jerusalem. He's going anyway. But it's going to be difficult. When he's there in the Garden of Gethsemane there and he's praying to his Father 3 different times, what did he pray for? Let this cup pass. If it be thy will, let this cup pass. He didn't want to have to suffer that death on the cross. He didn't want to have to go through that. And yet, he ends each prayer with, nevertheless, not my will, but thy will be done. Now, you've got to figure that Peter, James, and John, they're that inner circle. They're his closest friends, that they're going to support him in this and make it easier for him to do this. But Peter says, no, Lord, this isn't going to happen to you. Peter, do you not understand you're a stumbling block to me? You're making it hard for me to do what God wants me to do. It's difficult, but you're making it harder because you're one of my close friends and you're encouraging me not to die, not to go through with that. Well, there's a lot more that we want to say about that. Our time's gone, about a minute over. Let's have a word of prayer, and then we'll be closing out the class. Father, please help us in our study of your word together, that we might see readily, Father, the things that are meant here by thee, and understand clearly, Father, what our Lord was going through, and to understand, Father, the importance of heeding your will and doing what you want to be done. And knowing that when we do that everything will work out for our good, that we will be able to enjoy the victory that they have dreamed about and longed for so long. Dismiss us now in your care and keep us in thy care, Father, throughout this week. Bless those of us who are remaining for the second worship, and the others who have worshiped earlier, Father, bless them with safety and traveling home. In Jesus' name, amen.